We now want to look at one of the most indelible and famous of all American short stories, Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne, a story that's often characterized as a moral allegory, meaning abstract meaning comes through the story. The whole forest was peopled with frightful sounds, the creaking of the trees, the howling of wild beasts, and the yell of Indians, while sometimes the wind tolled like a distant church bell, and sometimes gave a broad roar around the traveler, as if all nature were laughing him to scorn. But he was himself the chief horror of the scene, and shrank not from its other horrors. In other words, what's in the mortal heart, this evil that we carry around in us in a demonic way, is even far more evil, perhaps, as Hawthorne saw things and as he portrays things here, than the devil and what the devil can wreak. "Ha, ha, ha," roared Goodman Brown when the wind laughed at him. "Let us hear which will laugh loudest. Think not to frighten me with your deviltry. Come witch, come wizard, come Indian powwow, come devil himself, and here comes Goodman Brown. You may as well fear him as he fear you." In truth, all through the haunted forest there could be nothing more frightful than the figure of Goodman Brown. On he flew among the black pines, brandishing his staff with frenzied gestures, now giving vent to an inspiration of horrid blasphemy, and now shouting forth such laughter as set all the echoes of the forest laughing like demons around him. The fiend in his own shape is less hideous than when he rages in the breast of man. And there it is, explicitly delivered to us by Hawthorne. Thus sped the demonic on his course until, quivering among the trees, he saw a red light before him, as when the felled trunks and branches of a clearing have been set on fire and throw up their lurid blaze against the sky at the hour of midnight. So we're at the witch's hour here, literally. And he paused in a lull of the tempest that had driven him onward and heard the swell of what seemed a hymn rolling solemnly from a distance with the weight of many voices. He knew the tune. It was a familiar one in the choir of the village meeting house. The verse died heavily away and was lengthened by a chorus, not of human voices, but of all the sounds of the benighted wilderness pealing in awful harmony together. Goodman Brown cried out, and his cry was lost to his own ear by its unison with the cry of the desert. In the interval of silence, he stole forward until the light glared full upon his eyes. At one extremity of an open space, hemmed in by the dark wall of the forest, arose a rock bearing some rude natural resemblance either to an altar or a pulpit, and surrounded by 4 blazing pines, their tops aflame, their stems untouched, like candles at an evening meeting. The massive foliage that had overgrown the summit of the rock was all on fire, blazing high into the night and fitfully illuminating the whole field. Even pendant twig and leafy festoon was in a blaze. As the red light arose and fell, a numerous congregation alternately shone forth, then disappeared in the shadow, and again grew, as it were, out of the darkness, peopling the heart of the solitary woods at once. Puritanism is often associated with harshness and the punitive, with sexual repression and hard work and draconic codes of conduct placed on men and women before they leave this vale of tears, as Shelley called it. But the cornerstone of belief is in God's omnipotence and his knowing who is to be saved and who is to be damned, and of all of humankind being marked with the original sin of Adam that led to the fall. Hawthorne was consumed with an obsessiveness about Puritanism and about his own Puritan ancestors. He wrote of them in a work of his called The Custom House, which is often considered as, quote, the great power of blackness. Hawthorne transports us into the dark part of the human mind, the part that wrestles with notions of human depravity and original sin. Goodman Brown and Faith have been married for 3 months, 1 trimester, when the story begins. And the newness of their marital union suggests the ties between original sin and human sexuality. The Puritan belief in witches is seen in the story in the mention by one of its characters, Goody Cloyes, that's Brown's catechism teacher, of her broomstick being lost or stolen, perhaps by an unhanged witch, and talk of magic potions of cinquefoil and wolfbane and, quote, the fine wheat and fat of a newborn babe, end of quote. The Puritans feared and actually persecuted the Indians, whom they viewed as godless and wild pagans who were residing in the woods, and did reside in the woods. And that's, of course, the central allegorical setting for paganism. It's a place where Hawthorne tells us there is no church. There's talk of powwows in the woods, and pre-industrial America often associated woods or forests with lawlessness, as well as with Indians. It's a place apart from the rules of faith and moral conduct, a place of anarchic freedom and the transparency of sin. Before we discuss the story Young Goodman Brown and its effect and meaning and value, let's find out a bit more about Hawthorne's life and who he was. Hawthorne's father died in 1808 when the author was only 4 years old, and his mother became a recluse. Hawthorne would also live an isolated life of seclusion and isolation, which shaped both his character and his vision, though all of that would change and he would wind up a famous and prosperous man. He was an editor and a novelist as well as a short story writer, and he also wrote children's stories, travel sketches and Gothic tales, and a children's history of the world that sold over 1 million copies but made him all of $100, the fee paid to him for the book. Later on, success would eventually come to Hawthorne, and he wound up in a relatively high diplomatic position. He was a college classmate and close friend of America's 14th president, Franklin Pierce. And in fact, Hawthorne wrote a presidential campaign biography for Pierce and was appointed by Pierce to Liverpool as U.S. consul. Hawthorne published his first tale in 1830, and 5 years later, he published Young Goodman Brown in an issue of New England magazine. The story later appeared in a short story collection of Hawthorne's called Mosses from an Old Manse. Let's talk about the story in terms of its meaning, interpret it to some extent, and its effect. It's really another horror story with the New England or Boston setting, steeped in Puritan folklore and theology, by contrast to Poe's Southern-nurtured Gothicism and European set tale. The horror in this story is, of course, in the meeting with the devil, but it's also in seeing people beneath their masks and everyday appearances, including those of piety and religiosity. But perhaps the most profound horror, as I've indicated, is in Goodman Brown himself, his loss of faith, his realization of the demonic force that is within himself. Implicit in the story is the moral suasion of the depravity of human nature and the evil that resides in the human heart. The fact that Brown's conversion, after he witnesses the Black Mass in the forest, is a chilling one, and one which Hawthorne saw as baleful, really comes upon us in reading this story. And I use the word chilling because we think of Hawthorne's Roger Chillingworth, the cuckolded husband in The Scarlet Letter, who allowed his intellect to encase his heart in a desire for revenge against the adulterer. Meeting? Be it so if you will, but alas, it was a dream of evil omen. For young Goodman Brown, a stern, a sad, a darkly meditative, a distrustful, if not a desperate man did he become from the night of that fearful dream. On the Sabbath day, when the congregation were singing a holy psalm, he could not listen because an anthem of sin rushed loudly upon his ear and drowned all the blessed strain. When the minister spoke from the pulpit with power and fervid eloquence, and with his hand on the open Bible, of the sacred truths of our religion, and of saint-like lives and triumphant deaths, and of future bliss or misery unutterable, then did Goodman Brown turn pale, dreading lest the roof should thunder down upon the gray blasphemer and his hearers. Often, awaking suddenly at midnight, he shrank from the bosom of faith, and at morning or eventide, when the family knelt down at prayer, he scowled and muttered to himself, and gazed sternly at his wife, and turned away. And when he had lived long and was borne to his grave a hoary corpse, followed by Faith, an aged woman, and children and grandchildren, a goodly procession, besides neighbors not a few, they carved no hopeful verse upon his tombstone, for his dying hour was gloom. Well, you're certainly left with a sense of the onerousness, the heavy burden that this man carries with him from this one experience. Life can be like that, by the way. I mean, people do have those kind of experiences that turn them around and turn them into gloom, or just the opposite, certainly. One could argue into euphoria as well. But for Goodman Brown, we don't know why he went into the forest, but when he comes out, the first scene, the Black Mass and communion feeling, and communion featuring the once angelic sable form of the devil, and the panoply of humankind, both good and bad. What is significant is that the story is spun to us in a realistic way despite its supernatural elements, and is made to include a strong didactic element, that is, a sense of teaching us about sin. You can see where Hawthorne was really, well, perhaps confused. The great Nobel laureate William Faulkner said, "Great literature is created when the heart is against itself." Faulkner had this Puritan heritage, like with J.R. in the TV show Dallas, if you remember that. If all was a dream, or why Brown needed to set out on his winter solstice journey in the first place. It's become almost trite to think of stories that are built on the pattern of a dream and that we don't know whether in ending the story it was supposed to be a dream or not. But Hawthorne was creating that ambiguity intentionally, I think, trying to give us a sense of just a dreamscape and the ambiguity of what can be imagined as opposed to what story that are with the unconscious and dreamlike, but it's also the associations that we might find out are tied to the writer or how they are tied to the writer. That's essentially how you would work psychoanalytically with a story like Young Goodman Brown. What's important to remember here, however, is there's a division in the story, a psychological division. The woods are id-like, unconscious. There's qualities of the mind and the whole world of Boston that represents the outer conscious self. In this way, Young Goodman Brown is kind of a harbinger, really, to Freud's famous work in the later part of his career, Civilization and Its Discontents, which one of my friends used to call Civilization and Its Discotheques. But that's a work that's really much more anthropological. The view is that civilization is driven and ultimately built by the id, by unfettered drives that are compensated for by the guilt of conscience, or what Freud called the superego. There's a multivalent message in Young Goodman Brown that shows really the thin membrane, the unpardonable sin of divorcing the intellect from the heart. Whether Goodman Brown experienced what he experienced in the woods or actually dreamt it, nevertheless, when he came out, his intellect seemed to take over. And that intellect taking over diminishes love or reference for the human soul. We saw this particularly in the character of Roger Chillingsworth in The Scarlet Letter. But it seems to me we see it ultimately also in Goodman Brown. And by the way, this is a story which, right from the opening paragraph, sets the mood and the tone, and both are masterfully sustained. Let me just give you an example of how that works. Young Goodman Brown came forth at sunset into the street at Salem Village, but put his head back after crossing the threshold to exchange a parting kiss with his young wife. And Faith, as the wife was aptly named, thrust her own pretty head into the street, letting the wind play with the pink ribbons of her cap. His wife is asking him, don't stay too long. She's not questioning why he's going in there, but she wants to know that he'll return and that things will go all right and that they'll have the life that they'd had up until the time when he felt, for whatever reason, compelled to go into the woods and to enter into this dark sphere. The language is really rich. It's sometimes prosaic, but it's nevertheless Puritan speech that we hear as vernacular. And there are combined elements in this story of realism and surrealism tied to this evocation of the unconscious, and fabulism, that is, fable-like effects, within the allegorical frame that move us from out of the forest or woods to inside the forest and then once again outside to the town. The story represents a spectacular, life-transformative journey into what Joseph Conrad, for Goodman Brown, is left hopeless and in gloom at the end. Here's a story that combines galvanizing and frightening effects with this great allegorical ambiguity, didacticism, teaching us, even though Hawthorne really may have had his own ambiguous sense of what was to be taught, but certainly providing a kind of moral compass for a rich harvest of great and rewarding reading. I strongly urge more Hawthorne, the novels as well as other masterful short stories like The Birthmark, the story of Elmer the scientist who thinks his wife is perfect, but then again intellect takes over because she has a birthmark and he wants to remove it, and you know what that leads to. Never tinker with Mother Nature. And his story of sinister and gloomy guilt, The Minister's Black Veil. One can understand the nature of Hawthorne's truly extraordinary and riveting gifts as a storyteller by, of course, reading other works of his, including his novels, such as The Scarlet Letter and The Blithedale Romance. And one can understand more completely the thrust of the story in our next lecture to Russia, and another famous and seminal story by the Russian master Nikolai Gogol. Like Poe, Gogol was born, coincidentally enough, in 1809, 5 years after Hawthorne, and was a seminal figure in the production of the short story Far Away on Another Continent in Russia, where it also came into prominence and flourished. Gogol's story is another tale cast in realism, but with strong elements of satire and, at story's end, the haunting presence of one of the original little men of fiction, a man of seeming no consequence who wants nothing more in life than a better overcoat to have against the freezing cold of St. Petersburg. Next, one of Russia's most famous and revered short stories, Nikolai Gogol's The Overcoat.